Hi, kiddos. So far we've talked about evolution. We've talked about the evolution of plants on land. We've talked about the different systems that they've evolved to be able to better survive on land. We've talked a little bit about how they respond to their environment. Now we're going to start talking about animals. And I want you to think about, as we dive into plants and animal systems, that structure is always related to function. And so if you look at this rabbit right here, you can see that this rabbit has specific characteristics that make it adapted to its habitat and its lifestyle. Its eyes are on the side of its head because it's a prey animal and it needs to look out for predators. It has those big old giant ears with the veins running through it to help keep it cool in the hot, hot summer. And so as we approach every system, whether it's a whole animal or we're looking at the way that the digestive system works, you're going to find out that the structure of that system is very efficient for its function or for its duty and job. So if we're going to talk about the development of animals, I wanted to start off with exactly where we originate from. We used to think that inside of the sperm of humans that there was a little tiny baby tucked inside and that was physically implanted into the female. We now know that it's a little bit more complicated than that. We know that there are pre-zygotic barriers, so before a zygote can be formed, barriers between a sperm and an egg. So each sperm has these special little chemicals that are on the tip of the sperm for that particular species. And those chemicals help the sperm eat through this protective layer around the egg. If it can get through that layer, then it can release the chemicals into the receptor proteins in the membrane of the egg. The moment that that happens, the egg will open up its membrane, suck the sperm in, and then release a whole bunch of ions. See how these ions are just waiting here to be released? It'll quickly release those ions and push all other sperm away so that the egg can't be doubly fertilized. This video will show you a sea urchin egg during fertilization. And so what I'd like you to watch is this egg is being fertilized here. See the ions pushing that protective membrane out? That sperm just penetrated and the ions got pushed out there. Let's go ahead and replay that. You can take one more look. You can see the ions pushing that protective barrier. There's the sperm and there's the barrier. Pretty cool, right? That now fertilized egg is going to start dividing and start dividing pretty quickly. This is a 4-stage cell stage. And then here's what we call an early blastula. A blastula is that first empty sphere of cells. Now at this stage, these cells are what we call totipotent. So if you've heard of stem cells, these cells could be become any part of the body. They can become anything. But even during those first initial cleavages, in between the cells, you can see there's a difference in the chemical components of the fertilized egg cell. So we have, egg cells have these things called cytoplasmic determinants. And those cytoplasmic determinants are just like a concentration of chemicals on one side of the cell rather than on the other side of the cell. So when the cell undergoes its first cleavage, you're going to have a difference in concentration in those chemicals. Now those chemicals determine what is going to eventually be the dorsal side, the ventral side, the anterior, posterior, and right and left side of the fetus. As that blastosphere continues to develop, it's going to start to pocket in and form the first tube. So that tube is really important because that is going to become the mouth and the anus as it goes all the way through. Depending on your evolutionary pattern, some species the mouth develops first and some species the anus develops first. For humans, our anus develops first. I'm skipping a couple of slides, but I just wanted to make a point that after that first tube is formed, there's going to be additional cavities that are formed that will become later organs and different tissues. In fact, very early on, your endoderm or your inner tissues, your mesoderm, which become things like your muscles, and your ectoderm, are going to be well established, which means that those cells that once could have become anything are now being differentiated. And we've talked about differentiation. When you go through gene expression and the genes start to get turned on and turned off, and some of them get turned on for a long term, some of them are variable, and some of them get turned off forever. So the cell can't ever turn those back on. Remember when we talked about that? So very early on, the ectoderm, the mesoderm, and the endoderm are established. So what those tissues are later going to become. So although they still have the ability to become any, for instance, if it was a mesoderm tissue, it could become any of these things. Or if it was endoderm, it could become liver, pancreas, thymus, thyroid. So it could become any of those things. But now it's already been differentiated, and some of those genes have been turned off permanently. The ones that could code for the endoderm becoming part of the nervous system, for instance. The goal of turning those genes on and off is so that you can get a final phenotype, right? So we talked about how those genes turn on for different times, the heterochrony, right? And based on how long those genes are turned on and off, you get different gene expression, or so it becomes a different physical phenotype, or what you look like on the outside. And different phenotypes then can be selected for by the environment. If you look at this tuna, penguin, and seal, you can see that they have some of the similar characteristics, right? They share some characteristics, which might mean that over time, they may have gone back into their fetal development and may be expressing more immature traits, or there's different genes that were developed over time to give them the same phenotype. Now, although they aren't related, they share these characteristics because a sleek body is what's necessary for swimming quickly in the ocean and escaping predators. The ones that had a sleeker body are the ones that are going to survive. The ones that express the right genes for the right time are the ones that are going to survive. So now we're really going to get into systems. So if you think about it, the first cells, when they ingested another cell, they just took the cells straight into their membrane, and lysosomes or some sort of vesicle that had digestive enzymes would help digest that organism. But then as you get to more complicated organisms, you're going to find that the systems get more complex. So we start off with organisms that just have a mouth. They actually don't have an anus. And so they take in food, and then they have to release their waste also through their mouth, right? So that's not very complicated. This little guy doesn't look very complicated, right? We've got some food coming in through a very rudimentary digestive tube. We have an anus now. We have an enclosed vascular system, right? So actually, compared to the last organism that was just doing a lot of membrane exchange, this organism is becoming more complicated. So as the organism gets more complicated, its systems also have to develop in order to meet the needs of the more complicated organism. So the systems that we're going to kind of briefly talk about are the digestive system, which is for food processing, the circulatory system, which is internal distribution of materials, respiratory, which is responsible for gas exchange, immune and lymphic, which is body defense, excretory, which is disposal of metabolic wastes, endocrine, which is the coordination of body activities, reproductive, which is focuses on reproduction, the nervous system, which coordinates body activities, integumentary system, which is the protection. It's your skin, it's your protection layer, skeletal system, and muscular system. We are going to just briefly, I just need you guys to know what each one of those systems does. And then we're going to just focus a little bit on the immune system, the nervous system, and the muscle system, because those are ones that kind of come up in a little bit more detail on AP exams. I wanted to remind you at the beginning of the lecture, we talked about how that rabbit, its structure was related to its function. And if you look at connective tissue, for instance, you can see that the structure of the connective tissue gives it some elasticity. If you look here, you've got fibrous connective tissue. You can see that that is maybe a little bit more resilient. And then if you look at, say, these fat droplets, see how large the vesicles are and how they're mostly filled with storage molecules, right? And so the structure of the cells and the tissues are each going to be related to the function. Even looking at the different types of muscles, you can see that skeletal muscle has a very, very different structure related to its function, whereas smooth muscles, like the muscles that help move digesting food through your intestines, they're not set up with those striations, right? So you can see how this is probably tougher than this type of muscle. Nerve cells are set up so that they can take in signals and release signals, and they can stretch far throughout your body to talk to other cells. The tissues are going to be different in different animals that have different needs. The fat in the river otter is going to be a lot different than the fat in a largemouth bass, because these are a temperature conformer. They just stay the temperature of their water ecosystem, whereas these are a temperature regulator. They make sure that they maintain a higher body temperature. I also wanted to talk to you about feedback mechanisms. So feedback mechanisms are when you've got a stimulus, and the stimulus either increases the response or the stimulus hinders the response. So for instance, let's think about a thermostat. You set it at 20 degrees Celsius. Let's say it gets too hot, right? It's summer, it gets too hot. The heater is going to turn itself off. Hopefully the room temperature is going to decrease and it goes back to 20 degrees Celsius. Or let's say you've got it set at 20 degrees Celsius. The thermostat gets too cold. Then all of a sudden the heater turns on, the room temperature increases until it's 20 degrees Celsius, right? And so that would be a set of feedback mechanisms. In this case, we're turning the stimulus turns off the response. And in this case, the stimulus turns on the response. That's the difference between a positive and a negative feedback mechanism. There's going to be a different response to the environment in an endotherm and an ectotherm, for instance, if they got cold. So for instance, the walrus is going to respond in a different way than the lizard, because this is an ectotherm and it's just going to get warmed by the sun. However, there's going to be lots of different feedback mechanisms in the walrus as it starts to either burn fat so that it can generate heat inside, or if it's going to respond to its environment by going into the water to help maintain that temperature homeostasis. We oftentimes don't think of our skin as our first response to our environment, but touch is very important, and your skin is a really complicated organ. This right here is just a quick overview of what your skin might look like. You've got nerves that are laying underneath your skin at different depths, and that allows you to detect different pressures. You have nerves that are attached to your hairs, so that can also help you respond to your environment. And so I just wanted to, this is your integumentary system, and I just want you to be aware that this is your first layer of defense and a very, very important response organ. When you're hot, oftentimes your blood vessels will move close to your skin so that evaporative cooling can cool your blood down and help keep your body temperature in homeostasis. That's why you get flushed when you're running. Or other organisms have different ways that they do similar cooling or warming systems. For instance, ducks will have their black legs so that they can actually absorb more sun temperature, and then they'll move their vessels in or out, or sit down on their legs to keep themselves warm. But let's look at how humans are going to take care of this homeostasis of temperature, right? So we're trying to maintain a stable set of internal conditions. We want to stay at our normal body temperature. So let's say you're here, you're at 36 to 38 degrees Celsius, you start to run, you're warming up. What's going to happen? Your sweat glands are going to secrete sweat, which evaporates, cooling the body. Your blood vessels in your skin are going to dilate, or they're going to get larger. Capillaries are going to fill, and your blood vessels are going to actually move closer up to the surface of your skin. That allows the blood to be exposed to that now cooling skin. And so hopefully your body temperature is going to decrease and you're going to go back into homeostasis, right? What happens if you get too cold? Well, you have a decrease in body temperature. The thermostat in your hypothalamus, a part of your brain that takes care of stuff like that, activates warming mechanisms. Your blood vessels in your skin are going to constrict to try to conserve that temperature and that heat energy. Your skeletal muscles are going to start to contract, and that's going to generate some friction and some other heat energy. Hopefully your temperature is going to increase. Then the thermostat turns down and you maintain homeostasis. Your digestive system also helps you to maintain homeostasis by keeping your blood sugar level steady. And different organisms have different ways of obtaining those nutrients to keep their salts and their sugars all steady inside of their body. But no matter how you eat, the goal is always maintain homeostasis. And the cycle almost always goes something like this. You're in homeostasis. There's a stimulation, which is it's going to cause you to recognize a change in your environment or stress. Your sensor or receptor is going to then relay that signal to your control sensor, and then you're going to have some sort of body response so that you can maintain homeostasis. So your body is always doing these feedback mechanisms to help you stay in the stable state of internal conditions. So your big challenge question for this, which was really a very quick overview of the development of systems, is how do the different systems aid in maintaining homeostasis? So how would the digestive system aid you? How would your respiratory system aid you? So we're going to go through the different systems, and we're going to talk about that in the next class. And I want you to also think about how is structure related to function. I'm going to have a couple of key questions